Hello, everyone. Do you remember back in April when many countries around the world went into lockdown? People stayed home, factories closed down. And what did the news headlines say? Wildlife reappearing in cities around the world. There were news reports of wild boars roaming the streets of Israel, of dolphins coming close to shore in Istanbul, Turkey, and sightings of cougars in downtown Santiago, Chile. This flourishing of wildlife during the pandemic served as, well, some lighthearted news at a time when many of us needed it, but also as a stark reminder of the environmental impact human activity takes on our planet. Did you know that even though the first half of 2020 saw the largest ever reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, the stock of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is at its highest level ever? As global attention has shifted towards the coronavirus pandemic and the economic crisis that has ensued, the crisis of climate change hasn't gone anywhere. And as economies reopen, the question remains, how will we avert the equally disastrous consequences of climate change that loom large on the horizon in many countries around the world, and in other countries are already a reality? My colleague Sangmo and I are here today to point out that the coronavirus pandemic offers a unique opportunity, an opportunity to make the right investments, to enact the right policies that will not only enable economic recovery, but also help tackle climate change. In other words, policymakers can make the economic recovery a green recovery. In Sub-Saharan Africa, our region of focus for today, greenhouse gas emissions on a per capita basis are still relatively low. However, the region is extremely vulnerable to the effects of climate change. African countries are facing rising temperatures, rising sea levels, and increased anomalies in rainfall patterns. This is already having impact on the ground. For example, in the desertification of the Sahel region, where as we speak, climate change is fueling mass migration and conflict. Increased variability in weather patterns is also fueling increased intensity and a higher frequency of natural disasters. Sub-Saharan Africa in the last 2 years alone has seen 2 cyclones, intense locust outbreaks, and droughts that have threatened the lives of millions. At the same time, Sub-Saharan Africa is home to the largest proportion of households that depend directly on agriculture for a living and live below the poverty line. This means that not only do incomes depend directly on the climate, but also when a natural disaster such as a flood or drought occurs, financial buffers to absorb that shock can be dangerously low, if not non-existent. This increased vulnerability and exposure to climate change means that climate change can have an extremely expensive toll on the economic output and on livelihoods in Africa. In research done for the Regional Economic Outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa here at the IMF, we estimate that just one additional drought can reduce medium-term economic growth by up to 1 percentage point. Meanwhile, households that experience a shock such as a flood or a drought are up to 20% more likely to report food insecurity. The toll that climate change is taking in Sub-Saharan Africa is large and growing, and people need protection. So what can African policymakers do to protect their economies and citizens from climate change? Over to you, Sangmo.
Thank you, Janet, and good morning, everyone. To answer that question about how to adapt to climate change, we can say there are 3 areas of focus for African policymakers. The first is to enhance key infrastructure. I'm going to give you 3 examples from different countries. The first is Mozambique. Mozambique has the port of Beira, which is an important trade hub in the region. But in 2019, there was a powerful cyclone which affected the Beira port and other parts of the country. But before that, there had been a lot of investment made to make this port more resilient to climate shocks. And as a result, even though the cyclone was really devastating, this port became operational within just some days from the cyclone. So that shows the importance of building a more resilient infra. The second example is from Kenya. Kenya is facing an increasing number of droughts. So it is important for Kenya to lower the dependence on hydroelectricity. What Kenya did is to promote off-grid solar-powered startups. So these lowered the dependence on hydroelectricity and also helped to increase the access to electricity from 25% to 75%. Also, they created a lot of jobs. So that is an example which contributed to building resilience to climate change and also helped the economy to grow. The third example is Ghana. It is important to raise agricultural productivity to ensure food security even at the time of climate shocks. So what Ghana did is to improve cocoa's drought resistance by distributing better seed varieties to farmers. We just talked about enhancing key infrastructure. Now the second area of focus is to invest in people. So we can talk about education. More literate farmers have a better access to climate information and weather information. They are more likely to adapt new technologies to enhance agricultural productivity. What about healthcare? Healthy individuals are less likely to get ill at the time of climate shocks, and if they get sick, they recover faster. These arguments are supported by our data analysis. So what you see on the screen is the impact of weather-related disasters on medium-term economic growth when structural factors improve to the average level of emerging market and developing economies. As you can see from this chart, in case of floods and storms, if education and healthcare improve, then the country tends to have lower impact, lower negative impacts of disasters on medium-term economic growth. By the way, let me remind you, we just talked about Kenya, and Kenya raised its access to electricity. And as you can see from chart, access to electricity contributes a lot in terms of the reduction of the impact of disasters on medium-term growth. So that confirms our case study. The third area of focus is to strengthen coping mechanisms. So we are talking about social safety nets. Also, we are talking about the access to finance. Let's take a look at Ethiopia. Ethiopia strengthened social protection, including through a productive safety net program. So this program is found very effective in terms of helping families at difficult times. Also, we can talk about the access to finance. If everyone has a bank account, then people can save, so they can be better prepared for future shocks. Also, they can borrow if they need. At the same time, it makes it a lot easier for the government to distribute cash transfers at the time of disasters. Now, we took a detailed look in Ethiopia. So we analyzed household survey data from Ethiopia. What you see on the screen shows that an Ethiopian household which has a bank account is a lot less likely to get hungry at the time of shocks. So this confirms the importance of the access to finance. The chart also shows the importance of different components, access to mobile phones and more robust housing, improved sanitation, and education. Eventually, all these components contribute to the three areas of focus, which are enhancing key infrastructure, investing in people, and strengthening coping mechanisms. Back to you, Gerrit.
As Sangmo just outlined, a green recovery in Sub-Saharan Africa is primarily about making smart investments that will, on one hand, improve living standards and contribute to reaching the Sustainable Development Goals, and on the other hand, raise resilience to climate change. In our analysis, we also find that investing in resilience today is cheaper than having to provide frequent disaster relief and reconstruction once a disaster has occurred. So, investing in a green recovery for Africa seems like a no-brainer, right? Well, unfortunately, even the right investments require financing. In the case of Africa, climate change adaptation is estimated to cost between 30 and 50 billion US dollars per year over the next decade. That is 2 to 3% of GDP annually, and looks particularly large against a backdrop where government budgets are already squeezed from the economic fallout of COVID-19. So securing the financing won't be easy, and it will require help from several sources. First of all, domestically, policymakers will need to double down on efforts to improve revenue mobilization and improve spending efficiency. The private sector has a large role to play, and policymakers should do everything possible to remove barriers to the private sector's participation. And lastly, financial support from the international community will be a necessary part of the equation.
Thank you, Janet. So now it's time to close our talk. We talked about the urgency to adapt to climate change in Sub-Saharan Africa. We talked about the policies to adapt to climate change. We also talked about how to finance. Now we are having a very difficult time. So the COVID-19 pandemic is threatening to wipe out the 10-year economic development in Sub-Saharan Africa. But there are a lot of things we learned from the pandemic. So one thing that we learned from the pandemic is that black swan events cannot be ruled out. We will continue to have black swan events, especially so if we continue to have climate change. So as this pandemic begins to abate, we now have an opportunity to put in place measures that promote a green recovery. Just like in 2008, when we had a global financial crisis, we had an opportunity to make our banking systems more resilient to future shocks. Now might be a great time to make ourselves more resilient to future shocks, including climate shocks. So let's work together. So for more information, please take a look at our Regional Economic Outlook chapter on adapting to climate change in Sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you very much.